Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Mudassar Shahzad from University of Education, and today we will discuss about the isolation, that is the next topic of evolution and principles of system. Dear students, first of all, we will discuss what is isolation. Isolation is basically a term used for separation of different organisms from their reproduction. Isolation may be in different forms. It may be prezygotic or postzygotic. Due to the isolation, we can prevent the hybrid offsprings that may introduce a new species. In this diagram, you can easily observe that there are two different species of rabbits in two geographical areas and distributed here. And both of the species are separated because of a huge river that is in between these two ecological niches. Due to this separation, they cannot interbreed with each other, so that's why their genetic makeup will be different from each other. If we talk about isolation that help in evolution, isolation is very important in evolution. You can easily observe in this diagram when two species of rabbits located on two different geographical areas, they must be separated from each other and evolved different genetic makeup in each other. Due to their different genetic makeup and their different ecological niche and geographical area, they must be differ from each other from each aspect. And both of the species will be called as two different species. In this diagram, you can easily observe the two isolating mechanisms, in which number one is prezygotic isolation and number two is postzygotic isolation. First of all, we will discuss about the different types of prezygotic isolation, in which number one is habitat, that may be called as ecological isolation, and number two is seasonal isolation, or it can be called as temporal isolation. The third one is ethological isolation, or it can be called as behavioral isolation, and the last one is mechanical isolation. On the other hand, if we talk about the postzygotic isolation, there are four different types of postzygotic isolation. Number one is gametic mortality. Number two is zygote mortality and hybrid inviability. And number third is hybrid sterility. And the fourth one is hybrid breakdown. We will discuss each the type in the next slides. But here I want to introduce about prezygotic isolation and postzygotic isolation. First of all, we will discuss the prezygotic isolation. Prezygotic isolation means to stop their breeding or to stop their formation of zygote. If we talk about the postzygotic isolation, in this type, different species may breed with each other and they form a zygote. After that, maybe zygote died or in the form of hybrid inviability, or may reproduce a hybrid sterile organism that cannot reproduce in their next generations. Now we will talk about the first type, that is called as geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is a type of prezygotic isolation that may become possible due to the prezygotic barriers. In this diagram, you can easily observe that there are two different species of deers. One is called as western deer population and the other is called as eastern deer population. But due to that geographical barrier, they cannot move to each other and reproduce with them. But suddenly, when some member of western deer population migrated towards the eastern deer population and some of the eastern deer population were migrated towards the western deer population. When they reproduce with each other, means western deer population and eastern deer population, when they reproduce with each other, there should be a genetic recombination in which two different recombinant animals will be formed out. Due to this genetic material transfer, a new hybrid organism will be reproduced. These geographical barriers may be in form of different barriers. There may be a mountain, there may be a sea or ocean, there may be a huge river, there may be a desert, there may be a glacier. All of these are called as geographical barriers. Due to these geographical barriers, many organisms cannot cross that barriers and reproduce with the animals of same species that are located on the other side of barrier. How does geographic barriers or geographic isolation contribute to evolution? Geographic isolation of a group of similar organisms eventually stops the gene flow from one group to another of the same species due to the presence of these barriers. These isolated groups may accumulate new mutations and new genetic makeup that may be differ from the other animals that are located on the other side of these geographical barriers. Due to these accumulation of mutations and a new genetic makeup, both of the species of the same group may differ from all the members of a same species form a single population on a single area. But all organisms of a single species would not be confined in a single geographical location, through they may interact or interbreed occasionally due to the presence of these huge geographical barriers. In nature, organisms are distributed in different areas, forming separate subpopulations. Here you can observe the subpopulations of human beings, in which some are called as Indians, some are called as Chinese, some are called as Arabic, some are called as European, and some are called as Americans due to the presence of their different geographical areas. Each subpopulation maintains a gene pool. When a member of different subpopulation migrate and interbreed, genes are exchanged between gene pool. As I have already told you about the human subpopulations. If a member of Indian population migrates towards the Arabic, European, American, or Chinese countries, he may interbreed with someone on that areas. Thus, the genes may be exchanged between both of them. Higher the gene flow, more like are the two subpopulations. In this diagram, you can easily observe the two populations in two different time intervals. First of all, you can see a population that is located in an area and they have the gene A capital A1 and is presented in red colors. And here is another population that is called as population 2 having alleles A2 and is showing blue color. But after some time, both the species, both the members of both the species were migrated to each other so that the gene flow from population 1 towards the population 2 and the some members of population 2 migrate towards the population 1. So here the due to these gene flows, different organisms may reproduce with each other, in which you can easily observe that in population 1, member of a population 1 interbreed with a member of population 2, there will be a gene flow and the next offspring between the breeding of these two members may be a hybrid that having the genes or gene pool that will be in between of population 1 and population 2. Similar will be presented in population 2. Here are some examples of geographical isolation in which I have already introduced you about the Darwin finches in our previous lectures, and the next example is porkfish and panamic porkfish. These both types of fishes, porkfish and panamic porkfish, are isolated due to the presence of Isthmus of Panama. That is a connection between North America and South America. Both of the species were separated due to the presence of this geographical barrier that is called as Isthmus of Panama. Both the species having different gene pool in which you can see their morphology. They are totally different from each other due to their isolation. Now we are going towards our second point, that is reproductive isolation may be a cause of evolution. Reproductive isolation is a factor that reduces the chances of interbreeding between two related groups of living organisms and is called as isolating mechanism or reproductive isolating mechanism. Due to the presence of this isolation, members of different species from producing offsprings can be prevented or ensure that any offspring are sterile. In this diagram, you can easily observe that there are two different populations of deers. One is in light color and the other one is in dark color, and both are separated due to the presence of a huge river in between the two ecological niches. Due to this isolation, they cannot reproduce with each other, so that's why their genetic pool may differ from each other. Now we are going to discuss the role of reproductive isolation in evolution. Reproductive isolation is must so as to allow the accumulation of variations leading to speciation by preventing hybridization. Reproductive isolation is very essential for a species to maintain its distinct identity. If reproductive isolation does not exist, then the variations may not arise. Here you can see that reproductive isolation and contribution to formation of new species, making organic evolution possible. These reproductive barriers must prevent the two species from exchanging genes through reproduction. The reproductive isolation is a condition in geographical barriers that prevent potentially interbreeding populations from cross-fertilization and genetically distinct from each other. Here you can see that reproductive isolation operates in following ways, in which number one is ecological isolation. In this isolation, species occur in the same area, but they occupy different habitats and rarely encounter to each other. In this diagram, you can easily observe the two different populations of iguana. Number one is land iguana and the other one is marine iguana. These two populations are living in two different habitats and they cannot interbreed with each other. Marine iguana can breed with marine organisms, whereas the land iguana can reproduce only the iguana that are present on land environment or in dry habitats. Dear students, now we are going to discuss the 7 different types of isolation, in which number one is ecological isolation. Ecological isolation in which two species are unable to meet due to different geographical areas, as you already studied in the above slide. And the number two is seasonal isolation, in which two different species having two different seasons for the maturation of their reproductive organs and their reproduction. The third one is ethological isolation, that is also called as behavioral isolation. In this, both of the members are of two different populations having different reproductive behavior. Due to these different reproductive behaviors, the members of two different populations cannot interbreed with each other. And the third one is mechanical isolation, in which male and female organs for mating differ from each other and prevent their union. Next one is physiological isolation, in which the mating is not possible because individuals of closely related species have different physiological behavior, and their physiological behavior is incompatible for each other. The gametes of one offspring cannot survive in other organism. And the next one is hybrid sterility, in which mule is an example. Mule is found by the female horse and male donkey. When a male donkey and female horse are interbreed with each other, the forming offspring called as mule. And at the end, seventh type is called as F2 breakdown. It is a very rare case in which all the mechanisms failed and a hybrid is fertile. It can reproduce only for one generation. The next generation cannot reproduce for their offsprings. And the third isolating mechanism is called as mechanical or chemical isolation. This is very important isolation of post-zygotic mechanism. It plays important role in evolution because it is actually a reason for reproductive isolation, thus deals to speciation by preventing hybridization. If two different species may interbreed with each other, then the mechanical or chemical isolation may prevent their development of offsprings. There is an example in which you can see an alpine butterfly that looks like similar and having different reproductive organs. And the next one is ecological isolation, in which their reproductive behavior, that is called as courtship behavior, may differ from each other and prevent their mating or interbreeding. There is an example of chiffchaff, wood warblers, and willow warblers. All of these animals having different courtship behavior. Due to their different courtship behavior, they cannot reproduce with different. Here is their diagrammatic explanation of ethological or behavioral isolation, in which number one bird is called as chiffchaff, that may resemble towards the wood warble, and wood warble is resembling towards the willow warblers. But all of three similar resembling animals cannot reproduce with each other due to their different reproductive behavior. Now we are going towards the seasonal isolation, in which two unrelated organisms having different seasons for their reproduction and the development of their reproductive organs. Due to the different reproductive organ developmental season, they cannot reproduce with each other. Here is example of seasonal isolation, in which there are two different types of frogs that are called as wood frog and leopard frog. Wood frog can reproduce only in March to April, when the temperature of environment is closely to 7.3 degrees centigrade. Whereas when we talk about the leopard frog, it can reproduce in mid-April, when the temperature is rises about 12.8 degrees centigrade. Due to these two different seasons and two different temperatures, wood frog and leopard frog cannot reproduce with each other. Dear students, now we will discuss about reproductive isolating mechanism. There are two types of mechanism that we will discuss in this lecture. Number one is prezygotic barrier, and number two is post-zygotic barriers. First of all, we will discuss about the prezygotic barriers and how it works. Prezygotic barrier works to prevent fertilizations. Now we are going towards its type. Number one is habitat isolation, in which similar species reproduce in different habitats. Number two is temporal isolation. It works as similar species reproduce at different time periods. Number third is behavioral isolation. It works as distinctive courtship behaviors. Similar species having different courtship behaviors. And the next one is mechanical isolation. Similar species have structural differences in their reproductive organs. And the last one is gametic isolation. Gametes of similar species are chemically incompatible. And the next one is post-zygotic barrier. It reduces the viability or fertility of hybrids. Number one is hybrid inviability. Interspecific hybrid died at early stages of embryonic development. In this type, after the fertilization, the embryo may die. And the next one is hybrid sterility, in which interspecific hybrid survives to adulthood, but the hybrid may be unable to reproduce offspring successfully. And the last one is hybrid breakdown, in which offspring of interspecific hybrid have problems of reproducing. Dear students, now we are going towards the seventh type of isolation, that is called as gametic isolation. It is also a type of prezygotic barrier in which the male and female gametes may come into contact with each other, but fertilization does not take place. Here are the examples of gametic isolation, in which you can see a sea cucumber releases their eggs and sperms in open water. The sperms recognizes their own species through chemical markers. If these chemical markers differ from each other, the sperm does not recognize the eggs, and egg does not recognize the sperm cell. So the fertilization does not take place. Here is the temporal isolation, in which species that would interbreed do not because the different species breed at different times. This is a very simple phenomena of isolation, in which both the different species cannot breed with each other. In the temporal differences, fertilization may take place at different times of the day, or different times of a year, or anything in between. There is a very simple example of toads. You can see in this diagram there are two different species of toads. One is called as American toad, and the second word is called as Fowler's toad. American toad may reproduce in early summers, but the Fowler's toad may mate in late summers. This temporal isolation, the difference in their mating season, means they do not interbreed with each other, and they cannot reproduce into hybrids. Temporal isolation is also a reproductive barrier. Now we will discuss how does it works to a speciation or into the formation of a new species. Temporal isolation, that is a prezygotic barrier. Two species that breed at two different times of a day or of a season or of the year cannot mix their gametes. Since the breeding time are different, there is no chance of reproductive contact. It keeps the different species separate. It causes reproductive isolation. Here again, you can observe the different examples of frog, in which number one is Rana aurora that breeds in March to in January to March, and other one is the species named as Rana boli that breed in late March to May. Now we are going towards the post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. These isolating mechanisms which operates after. Number one is gamete mortality. In this type of isolation, different or same species may reproduce with each other, but the gamete of these species that is called as hybrid gamete will not survive. When the interspecific cross destroys either sperm or egg, sperm encounter an antigenic reaction in genital tract of female and will be immobilized and killed before having a chance to reach towards the egg. So, insemination reaction in Drosophila is an example of gamete mortality. Dear students, now we are going towards the second type of post-zygotic isolation, that is called as hybrid inviability, or it can be also called as zygote is not viable or zygote is inviable. In this type of isolation, the egg and sperm may fuse to each other and form a zygote, but the zygote either does not develop or developed into an offspring having less viability rate. When the sperm and zygote from two different species are able to fuse during fertilization, but it does not mean that zygote will survive. There are two cases. Number one, the zygote may die after fertilization. Number two, if the hybrid does manage to make it to birth, it often has at least one or more likely multiple defects that keep it from becoming a healthy functioning adult that is able to reproduce and pass down its genes to next generation. That may be called as a sterile offspring. Adult of hybrid species are not viable. Dear students, if the hybrid is able to survive through the zygote and early life stages, it may become an adult. But it does not mean that it will thrive once it reaches to adulthood. Dear students, now we are going towards the hybrid sterility, that is a third type of post-zygotic isolation. The hybrid has normal viability rate but the hybrid is sterile. In this type, hybrid sterility is common if two parent species have different chromosome number, in which one example is already given in above slides, that is mule, in which two different parents, horse and donkey, were involved to form a hybrid offspring. Here you can see two different species. Number one is horse. In this hybrid, female horse will be involved and male donkey will be involved for the formation of a mule. Horse having 64 number of chromosome, whereas a donkey having 62 number of chromosome. The hybrid that is called as mule having about 63 number of chromosome but is sterile. It cannot reproduce in their life stages. Now we are going towards the next type of prezygotic isolation, that is called as hybrid breakdown. Even when a viable and fertile hybrid between two species are obtained, but some barriers still exist if hybrid of second generation are from backcross of F1 hybrid, two parental species are inviable. There is an example of two different species of Drosophila. Here, here is the explanation of these two species, in which both the species are interbreed with each other, producing two different types of offsprings. One is called as fertile female and the other one is sterile male. When the fertile female is crossbreed with their parental generation, the hybrid will be weaker than both of the parent of F1, whereas the sterile male cannot reproduce into next generation. These isolating mechanisms always have a partially genetic basis. For vast majority of animals, it is still not known which particular mechanism prevent closely relating species from interbreeding. If one isolating mechanism fails, another must overcome. There are a lot of isolating mechanisms that we have discussed in this chapter. Next, there is the examples of hybrid sterile, in which one example we have already discussed as in the form of mule. Next, we will discuss about the liger and zonkey. Firstly, we will discuss about the liger. Liger is the hybrid of father lion and tiger mother. Probably it does not happen in nature since don't overlap ranges. Males usually sterile in this generation. The next example is zonkey, in which zebra father and donkey mother. They reproduce and interbreed with each other, forming a new species, a new animal that is called as zonkey. They are found in South Africa and males are usually sterile. Number 10th one is physiological isolation. In this type, hybrid offspring are not formed or have lower fitness level. Their survival of genes may not fit in that local environment, and the offspring may die out. Thank you, students, for your concentration. We will meet in our next lecture. Till that, Allah Hafiz.